The Trouble with Harry, a rather peculiar item in the Hitchcock canon, a kind of black comedy thriller, a possible treatise on the state of morality itself and the more idyllic, prosperous, peaceful communities in the world. Let's consider, would The Trouble with Harry have been made in the 20s, 30s, or 40s? If not, why not? Now, we could cite some general unwelcome attitude toward this kind of comedy prior to a more open and less prudish America or Western world developing after the Second World War, although there might be a bit more to it than that. Would one have considered this story at all viable, even as an exaggerated comedic piece, in a prior decade of American media? Could it have been that there was something about the American character that had become apathetic and immoral, which allowed the trouble of Harry as a narrative premise to be considered in the first place at all? The author of the source novel, Jack Trevor's Story, was an English writer whose text for Trouble with Harry was published in 1949 or 1950, depending on where one receives the information, set in England, plausibly I've not read the text, and presumably reflecting concerns related to the class dichotomy of British society. Trevor's Story was known to be of working class background and decidedly anti-establishment. Was his text an attempt at quasi-Wildian satire with a more sardonic, sensational, creepy bend? Well, the sense of utter superiority had left the Brits behind after America dropped an atomic bomb on Japan, and a more immoral actor was rather difficult to imagine, and so the proud, generally indifferent attitude to human death wound up becoming one of the defining traits of the more wealthy American classes. The institutionalized distribution of regularly violent Western guns and outlaws media was to have an effect on the American psyche, and the competing mold of fictional entertainment was, likely as not, World War II stories, depictions of older American wars, or more contemporary thrillers about men with handguns and ties to the law enforcement, in some manner usually. Could one have imagined an idyllic American town where the events of the trouble with Harry taking place during the 1920s, 30s, or 40s? In an English context, one first imagines this in the context of some exaggerated depiction of the bourgeoisie, as with European satires in general, and whilst the Hollywood Trouble of Harry isn't an assault on any aristocracy, it is looking at a very well-off and unbelievably saccharine pocket of America's social landscape, an economically seemingly comfortable Innisfree, and whilst Vermont seems like a nice place with fairly nice people, it is hardly the Midwest, and urban inner city, far less privileged existence, or a decaying locality in the south or southeast. The fact is, the trouble with Harry's corner of Vermont is the more privileged, cordoned-off, white blinders America, entirely ignorant of the struggles of the rest of that nation. If one is to potentially consider the trouble with Harry an act of social critique, they first have to register that the location and community depicted in it is one worth criticizing, or even that the composers would consider this as part of their project in the first place. There is certainly authorial attention given to the fact that the area is an isolated one compared with the rest of American society. There is a sense of its players living on a cloud, blithe to these moral concerns, and there is a sense of these players being overgrown children, less mature than the boys in Stand By Me, or maybe less monstrous than what we see in Potter's Blue Remembered Hills, who have had a stunted arrested development, due to their staying in this one isolated environment for their entire lives. The child in this film seems more horrified by the death, if only marginally so. My favourite elements of the film are Robert Burke's photography, the generally entertaining script, and the great Shirley MacLaine introducing herself to us grateful film audiences. Possibly one of the better Hitchcock films, if it isn't quite one of the best, and an incredibly impressive act of tone. It would be a rather difficult emotional atmosphere to conjure, a morbid occurrence which still feels morbid as you witness the cast's apathy to it, which compounds our own morbidity, whilst having us intrigued by how the events will conclude, what will occur to the players, and at least a vague sense that Hitchcock is mining humour out of the circumstances, is doing so whilst attempting to illustrate the flat affect disposition of certain more prosperous Americans where the most moral concerns manifest in their manicured lives. Plausibly, Hitchcock just wanted to devise a grim, sickly, humorous thriller, for why would one consider depicting humans, Americans in this case, this way unless they had some motivation to? Why would one imagine the circumstance unless they felt as though there was something rather sick crawling underneath the American character's smiling facade? I'm not saying it is as dense as Kubrick's The Shining as an analysis of the American pathology and submerged guilt in this case, but wouldn't it be exciting if it really were?